Hello, I'm Claire Mooney, the editor of Quilter's Companion. Today we want to help you to discover the joyous craft of patchwork and quilting. In so doing, we are going to demonstrate some of the main techniques required to construct a patchwork quilt, and I have Michelle Marvig along to share her expert knowledge and experience. Thanks for joining us, Michelle.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of the project, Claire.
I want to start by asking you how you got interested in quilt making and how long you've been making quilts for.
19 years ago, Mum and I opened a shop in Mudgee, New South Wales, where we put in dressmaking and patchwork. Patchwork at that stage was not as popular as it is, and it didn't really sell until I started to make sample quilts. So I had to learn to sell the fabric.
And you've been hooked ever since?
Unfortunately for my husband.
Well, Michelle, we'll start by talking about the basic tools and equipment that we all need to make a quilt. And the biggest purchase that we're ever going to have to make is a sewing machine. So we'll start by talking about that. What are the key things to look for when we're purchasing a sewing machine?
Good quality straight stitch, a blanket stitch if you want to applique on the machine. You might look at the size of the throat space that you have.
Right.
The size of the motor will determine how well your machine will quilt when you come to the quilting section of it. And a needle down function, which is something that not many people would consider when they buy a machine. But if the needle will stop in the fabric, then we can actually not lose our sewing line as we're sewing.
Okay, and what machine are we using today?
Today we've got the Bernina Aurora 440. It's one of the most popular machines with quilters today because of all the functions that this machine has. It's been built for us quilters.
Right. All right, terrific. And do we need specialised feet when we're talking about making quilts on a sewing machine?
Makes your life so much easier.
Okay, so what do we need?
1/4 inch foot, which is actually on our machine at the moment, because if we can keep our seam allowance accurate, it'll make all our pieces fit together at the next stages a lot easier.
Right.
So that's a definite.
Yep.
An open toe applique foot. Now that foot actually has a bigger opening between its arms so that you can see where your applique is going through, but it also is cut out underneath to take the bulk of your applique. So it has two features. So we've pieced and we've appliqued, that's only the top of the quilt. You then need to join the 3 layers together, which is actually the quilting of it.
Yes.
If we're doing straight line quilting, we need a walking foot.
Okay.
This is the Bernina walking foot. It looks the same for many of the other machines. They're quite bulky. We'll talk about how the arm works later on in the quilting section.
Yes.
But on some machines it can be an inbuilt even feed foot. So you just need to ask with the different models.
Right.
This is what most people will require.
Yep.
The other is a free motion foot for doing stippling and free motion quilting. Yep. It can look, this machine, the Bernina Aurora 440, actually has a stitch regulator on it. So the one for this foot for the machine is quite a bit different to the standard feet which other people may have.
Right.
Both work on the principle though that there's actually a spring in the foot, so it's not actually holding the fabric as firm so that you can move the foot over the fabric.
Okay. All right, great. So that's all the features covered with the machine, and the main other equipment we need are rotary cutters, rulers and mats. So can you quickly run us through those?
Absolutely. Even if you're a hand piecer, you'll often come back and cut by the rotary cutter anyway. Yep. Rotary cutters come in 3 main sizes. The small one I use for nimble curved cutting in pieces, not for general cutting. 45mm is the one that most people will want to have as their basic cutter. The large one, I like it for when I'm doing lots and lots and big quilts and just straight cutting. It's too big to get around curved pieces. So in general, the 45mm. You'll notice I've actually got a little tail on mine. Because I teach in class situations, I like to keep my cutters separate from other people's by
identify them.
By an identifying feature. Yep. So that's our cutter. The cutter works in conjunction with a self-healing mat. And as you can see, we've got several here today. They do come in different colours. Yep. The pink one was actually one that was done for breast cancer, so it was a limited edition thing. They all work on the same process, that as you cut with the blade, it's not going to actually damage the top of the mat.
Yes. Yep.
That's 2 of the 3.
Right.
Then we need a ruler.
Yep.
In Australia we have Matilda's own rulers, which are this fluorescent green. The other Australian is the So Easy, which is the clear with the red. Either one is fine. We also have the Omni thread is an American one. It's a little bit harder to find out here. Because of the cost, the Australian ones are a better option for Australian girls price-wise.
Right.
There is no difference in the quality between the brands. It may just be which one your eyes can simply work with.
I was going to say, the colour difference is quite noticeable. So.
It is very noticeable. The one thing I would suggest is that of these 3 rulers, this size, which is 6, 6.5 or 8.5 by 24 in length, is the first ruler I would buy, and it's the one that you can make most quilts out of.
Yep.
We've got a selection of other specialist rulers here on the table. You work up to those. This is your base ruler to have when you first start. And again, the mats come in a variety of sizes, which we also have on the ruler. A medium-sized mat is the basic one to start with.
Yep, and this one we'll show viewers this later on, but this one's actually a rotating mat, which is
really
handy.
Cool.
Very handy.
It is.
All right, well that covers our cutters, mats and rulers. So the next thing that I want to talk about is threads. So what sort of thread are we going to piece with?
We're working with cotton fabrics. I like to work with cotton thread.
Okay.
We often piece for hours at a time, given a chance. And if we're going to iron, the cotton thread won't melt when we iron it. But it's also, if this dress put on the quilt, the thread itself is likely to break rather than us trying to repair a hole in the fabric.
Right.
But neutral colours. Even behind us you can see an array of different colours used in the quilts for this magazine. I piece in 3 basic colours. If I'm piecing something very light toned, I'll use it just off-white. If I'm piecing, 90% of the quilts that I do will be warm colours, and I'll use a mid-beige because it will just blend into everything.
Yep.
And it's only if I'm doing grey, black or blue quilts that I will actually use a mid-grey.
Okay.
That way you're not trying to buy a thread to match every quilt that you're making. You can just go to your cupboard and have a good neutral there.
Yep.
If you are going to do a lot, I've brought the bigger cones along today because they actually are better value.
Yeah, definitely. And always have a few bobbins wound.
Yes, it does save you quite a bit of time if you can wind up half a dozen. If you're always working with this one, which is Gutermann 1225, which is what I do use. Even when I'm quilting, I find it's a great neutral.
Right.
It's nothing for me to wind 6 bobbins at the beginning, so I don't have to go back and have to keep rewinding them.
And finally, Michelle, we obviously need fabric to make our quilts. So what kind of fabric are we going to use?
We're going to use good quality patchwork cottons. They're 100% cotton in a variety of prints, but the ones that you can find in your specialist patchwork stores I feel are better than those that you can find elsewhere. Besides that, the person behind the counter will know how to help you select what you want to make the quilt.
Yep, very true. All right, well we have heaps of sewing to get on with, so we'll move on to cutting strips.
Yes, Claire, let's get into it.
Accuracy in patchwork begins with the cutting of your fabric. So Michelle, can you explain, to start with, how do we cut accurate strips?
Okay. Fabric as it comes off the bolt already comes with 1 fold and 2 selvage edges.
Right.
When you're asked to cut a strip of fabric in your instructions, it actually means from selvage to selvage. While our ruler is long enough to make that, I actually find it easier to take this folded edge and fold it up and create 2 folded edges to cut from. There is a but though. If we're going to cut short like this, we need to make sure that the bottom fold, which lines up now with a line on my base fold of my fabric, the new fold I've just made, is parallel with the top fold of my fabric. And in this case it's not, I can see a little bit. So I just need to adjust this a little bit.
Okay.
It's worth taking the effort to do this stage. If you don't do this, you will end up with a strip which has a bend in the middle of it instead of a straight strip.
Right.
So again, my baseline is on my new fold, and this time I'm above the line in the same position.
Okay.
This is not the fabric that Katrina has used in her quilt, but for Katrina's quilt she needs 2.5-inch strips, so I'll cut a 2.5-inch strip to demonstrate. But at this stage, the fabric as you've purchased it also has a daggy end that we need to cut away. You never want to cut towards yourself, that's not safe and you're not strong. I'm a right-hander, so I have the bulk of my fabric on the right-hand side. For a left-hander, they would do the same, but they would set up with their bulk on their left.
Okay.
So then I'm going to find the size of the strip that I want to cut this time, 2.5, and I'll slide that over until the 2.5 inch measurement is inside that uneven edge of the fabric.
Right.
I'm lined up with my base fold so that I'm cutting at 90 degrees to that fold, and now I will make one firm cut. Rotary cutter, when you pick it up, it should be closed. You need to pull back to open the blade. I start my blade rolling before I get to the fabric. I roll right across and past.
Okay.
And before I put my blade down, my cutter down, I make sure my blade is closed. Number one rule, safety.
Yep.
Yep.
Because these are razor sharp, aren't they?
They are absolutely razor sharp. It's very easy to cut fingers and other bits and pieces, so please be careful. This first strip we need to gently flip over so that now we can straighten the other edge.
Okay.
So now, because I have a size to cut to, an exact size, I put again my line along the base fold. The 2.5 inch mark I'm lining up along the cut edge that I've just made, and now I can trim the size of that strip back to a neat, accurate 1/4 inch. So that gives us one 2.5 inch strip.
Okay. And before we go on, I just want to ask, why are you working on the back side of your rotary mat? Because it's actually marked on the other side, isn't it?
It is, and it's a habit of mine that I find that while I have the markings on the mat and the markings on the ruler, it can actually be really busy to your eye, particularly if you have the yellow marks on the ruler. So if I work on the back, which is plain, it's the same surface as the front, but there's nothing else to disturb your eye. You just work with the lines on the ruler.
Okay.
In the classes that I've taught, I've come across people who've used the mat continually to cut their strip from, and they've actually ended up cutting out divots in along the 1 inch and the 1/2 inch, the sizes that you use a lot. If you've got an 8 inch cut in your mat, then it's going to change the size of the strip that you get. So work to your ruler, not to your mat.
Okay then.
Yeah.
Right, so we're starting off, we're cutting strips for the first project in the magazine, which is Katrina Hadger-Michael's quilt, which is hanging behind me here on the wall. So once we've cut the strips, what are we looking to do next?
We've just talked about what a term a strip is, in that it's a selvage to selvage full width of fabric cut, but another term we use is a cross cut.
Okay.
So for Katrina's project, she actually has in the centre of her blocks the sashing between her piece sections. These are 2.5 by 4.5. So we're actually going to start with a strip like we've just cut. And again, to demonstrate, I'll use the lighter fabric so that you can see the marks on the ruler better. So we take the strip that we've just cut. One little trick or thing to consider is that you've got an edge with the 2 selvages on it or a folded edge. If you cut from the folded edge, you may get one less cut out of a strip. So we always cut from the selvage edge.
Okay.
In this case, as I said, for this project it's a 2.5 by 4.5. We already have our 2.5 inch size. So now I'm actually going to measure along, put a line along the base cut of the fabric this time. We don't have a fold, we have the cut edge. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches more or less on my fabric here, but I've got the 4.5 within the end of the fabric. So again, I'm going to cut the first one long so that I can cut away from myself.
I mean, these rotary cutters are so sharp, you really don't need to press terribly hard either, do you?
No. Well, if they're quite blunt, you may need to, but
or change your blade.
Change your blade, yes, because it will also it'll often leave threads and things behind which will make a pull in your fabric, so it's worthwhile. You don't need to change the whole cutter, you just change the blade.
Yep.
So having cut the first one, I can now come down and cut that entire strip into 4.5 inch lengths. So in every stage you are lining up still, this time now with both cut edges, so that you are cutting 90 degrees all the time. this cut edge is the guide for your sewing edge. So if you're not accurate with your cutting, then you're already iffy with your seam. Now with this one, if I go back and cut our first one, I'll show you exactly why we want to cut from the selvage edge to start with. That gives me 8.
Yep.
8 lengths. This is my fold. If this had been the selvage, I would not be able to get an extra one off it. But because I've cut from that way, I've now got one more piece, which I can come along, place this down and cut my 9th 4.5 inch rectangle off that strip of fabric. Had I cut from the selvage, I would have only got 8.
Yep.
So that's a cross cut in a plain strip, but also in Katrina's project, she has 4 patches. We could cut them as individual squares, but it would be far quicker if we actually sew, because the combination is consistent. We can sew a pink, or we might sew a yellow to a pink, if one can get the colours right, or a yellow to a blue, and then we can come back and cut a sewn strip, which has another technique as well in there.
Okay then.
Okay. So,
actually, just before we go any further, I just wanted to ask you one more question about cutting strips from a large piece like this. Once you've squared up the fabric the first time, do you ever need to square it again?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And why is that?
The fabric's manoeuvrable. It is a woven thing. Each fabric will react differently, but as you cut, you're putting a pressure on it. And at 2.5 inches, I might only get 3 strips before I have to align the edges again.
Right.
At 1.5, I might get 4 to 5, 6 strips out before I find that it won't line up.
Okay.
If 4.5 or 6.5, I might line up everything for every cut. The bigger the cut, the more likely you are to have to cut and re-straighten every strip.
Right. So always double check that
You've not done anything wrong if you're finding that when you lay this down you can't line that back up and get a 90 degree from the fold to the cut edge. It just means that it's being pushed off with the pressure of the cutter and you're holding it down.
Yep.
So please re-straighten your top and bottom fold again.
All right then. Okay, so what are we moving on to?
Here's our strips we cut earlier.
Yes.
2.5 inches this time in our yellow and our pink.
Yep.
And now we're going to seam them together. The fabrics aren't necessarily always going to be the same width. Well, in this case they are because they've come from the same range.
Yep.
But don't concern yourself if they're not the same.
Right.
The 1/4 inch foot is already on my machine. The machine itself, though, comes with a default stitch length of 2.4. Because I want to come back and cross-cut this set of strips, I want to shorten my stitch length so that when it's cut up into the 4 patches, this is not coming undone here.
Right.
And if you leave a longer stitch length, it can tend to come undone as you're putting the quilt together.
Yep.
So I'm not going to shorten it all that much. I'll bring it down to 2. So it will take a little bit longer. And the other thing, now that I've started, I'm going to engage that needle down function on here so that I'm not going to lose my sewing line, and I'm also going to make it sew faster.
Now for a beginner, would you recommend that they pin the 2 strips together, or is it enough to gently hold them in place?
I think gently holding it in place would be fine, but maybe not going quite as fast. But I keep readjusting every time I come down, and because they are the same size, you're always just making sure that the 2 cut edges are sitting neatly together. It's a long way to the end.
It is.
But that's good, because we'll actually get 17 2.5 inch cross cuts out of this strip set, which will make 8.5 4 patches. Katrina has 3 variations of blocks in her quilt, but all are constructed in the same manner.
Right.
getting near the end, I find that people tend to pull out in trying to see. So it's critical that you stay straight right until the very end of your strip. Now it's done its needle down, now I need it needle up. Cutter on the side means I don't need a pair of scissors.
Yes.
They're sewn but they're not pressed. Again, critical.
Right, and there's our iron.
Our iron's just told us we've taken too long.
Now, Michelle, we've all had a go at ironing, but there's really a certain technique to pressing for patchwork, isn't there?
Well, there's a technique that I like.
Right.
For several reasons. In this case, these strips were lovely and straight and flat and were a nice even length. So there's no discrepancies in it.
Mm-hmm.
But the seam's a little bit raised, so it can be harder to push the seam over. So the first thing I like to do is to iron flat once my ironing cord gets out of the iron and push that seam back. But what this could be would be if I had a piece and a plain, it would help to flatten it and encourage it to go the way that I wanted it to go.
Right.
It's also, when I've placed the strip down, we have a light and a dark today in the yellow and the pink. I want to press towards the pink, so I have that strip on the top. So I've pushed that seam back into the fabrics.
Right.
And now I'm going to come along with the side of the iron and iron from the front, not from the back, to encourage that seam to go the direction that I want.
Yep.
Because one of the other things that can change the size of your strips is if you iron a pleat into the centre.
Okay.
So you want to iron it from the front so that you don't have any pleats in the resulting strips that are sewn together.
Mm-hmm. You do need to be careful here that you don't press too vigorously and distort the strip, don't you?
It can easily. We're on grain with these because they're a straight one, but particularly if you're working with something biased like we will later on,
yep.
Be very gentle with the iron. We're not pushing and pulling, we're guiding and gently pushing it in the direction that we want. So once we've actually ironed our strip and we've got our seam going the way that we want, and when I turn over, the seam direction hasn't changed, it's consistent. So while this is not that important to us at this stage, when we come to quilt, we want to quilt in a ditch, we've got a ditch to follow, or this is also going to give us 2 interlocking seams which will make it easier to get the point at the next stage.
Okay then, so now we've pressed, what do we need to do next?
Back to the cutting board, Claire.
Right, Michelle, well we're back from the ironing board, so what are we doing now?
We need to cross-cut our beautifully ironed and sewn strip.
Mm-hmm.
We cross-cut before, but it was a plain strip with no seam in it, and we cut from the cut edge as our guide. This time, when I have strips that are sewn together, I actually line up on the seam, not on the cut edge.
Okay.
So again, we want to make squares. Mm-hmm. So there is a 2.5 inch cut, then our 2.5 inch cross cut.
Right.
So a line on my ruler, I can find a plain one, can come down along the seam that I've just pressed. And again, my 2.5 is inside that edge for the first cut. So I'm going to cut the first one wide.
Right.
So I'm not actually cutting off or using the edge of the strip as my guide. I'm actually using the seam allowance, because by doing that it means that I am cutting a 90-degree angle from the seam, not from the cut edge.
Right.
So that if we have deviated a little along the seam, it will still give us the same distance. If you don't cut a 90 or keep your angle consistent, it will actually change the length of this piece.
Right.
So that's why it's important that we actually do cut from the seam. So there is something else that can happen though as you're cutting down the strips. We've made 2 cuts, which will now make our 4 patch for this quilt.
Yep.
But if I turn the ruler around, which I can for this one, we've got 6.5 inches. I've got a full 1/2 inch. If I turn it around to do a 1/2 inch size, I can get a whole length on the edge. When I do that, I may find, and I have, which is wonderful, that when I lay this down, while I'm lined up here and I'm lined up here, it's actually slightly off in here. So again, just like we have to re-straighten all the time with our strips, we also need to re-straighten even with seamed pieces.
Okay.
So again, I'll cut that wider and flip it over and trim it back. And it will literally only be a couple of threads at this stage, and it's not the entire length. It is actually only that much off the pink, but already that would have put that not on a 90-degree angle.
Yes. Yeah.
So as you cut down the strip...
And it just gets exaggerated, doesn't it?
It does get further and further exaggerated.
So we just continue down the length of the strip, cross-cutting?
Cross-cutting at the 2.5-inch intervals in the number that Katrina's given in the magazine.
Okay. And now you're going to show us...
how important or why we pressed consistently.
Right.
That now when I take the pieces that we need to make our fore patch, we want to line up that centre seam to keep it neat, that when I flip these guys over, the two pieces are going to lock into one another beautifully, and it just makes it so much easier to keep that point. And wherever possible, if you can press for opposing seam allowances, which this one is, because one's going to the left and the other to the right, it will actually make it easier to sew.
Right. Now, is there a trick to how you pin? Because I have seen people pin from the top as well, so...
It's a personal preference. I like to sew over my pins because I feel I can hold the seam in the place that I want it to be longer.
Right.
In this case, I'm going to come down this edge. I've pinned the seam that is more likely to flip, because if I'm coming down this way, that's going to push that seam anyway to the direction I want it to go. But it's the one underneath that might flip back and give me grief at a later stage. So I've pinned that one that's going to flip.
Okay. And my last question before I let you get onto the sewing machine is there a specialty pin that you're using?
I've got glass head pins. What they really are, though, is a fine shaft. If you get a really thick shaft and I'm sewing over it, I can damage my machine. I also find they don't make as much damage in the fabric. You can get flower heads as well. You can get shorter ones and longer ones. It doesn't matter to me what colour or whether they're short or long. It's actually the fineness of the shaft that I like. Yeah.
Okay, then I'll let you get sewing.
Because that's actually one of the pins that are sold as quilting pins are like crowbars, and
not very good.
Not nice for your machine.
No.
Back to sewing. So again, with the bananas, you must always hold your thread when you start. But as I've come to the pin, I've slowed right down. I could pull it out if I needed to, but in this case, I'll actually jump over it. And by the magic of television, we have a beautiful point in the middle of our fore patch.
Right.
But that's because we've done the preparation.
Yes.
We've done a nice straight seam, we've done a nice straight cut, and we've pressed for opposing seams. The final press in your fore patch actually won't matter, because where it goes in the block, there are no seams.
Right.
So you can press left or right, it won't matter.
Okay then. And you've got the pieces or components laid out here to complete one of the blocks.
Yes. This is the main block in the quilt that we need more of. So it has two yellow-pink fore patches, two yellow-blue fore patches made exactly the same way.
Yes.
4.5 by 2.5 inch lengths of our sashing strip, and they get sewn between the fore patch units. They also get sewn between the centre sashing.
Right.
So that it becomes made in 3 rows, which is consistent for a lot of blocks. You will actually complete a block in rows. And if I turn it over, you'll find that we've pressed away from the bulk of the seams in the fore patch towards the red consistently, from the top to the middle to the bottom. So again, these seams will lock into one another.
Right.
So then it's, again, we sew down, pin and sew down that seam. You can do that to either side, and that will complete the block.
Right.
Katrina gives further instructions in the magazine for the number of the different variety blocks that she needs in her quilt.
Okay, and finally with Katrina's, her blocks are what we call set straight, is that correct?
It is, in that the square blocks end up on square as they're constructed, not as a diamond on point. So it's a much easier setting than something that's on point, like the Japanese one that Anne has made.
All right, and that's our next project up.
It is.
Here we're looking at Anne Summerlad's quilt, which the first step in this quilt is also the strip piecing, but there's a couple more techniques you'd like to explain with strip piecing with this one, isn't there?
There is. In this case, we've got 4 strips sewn together. Again, they're 2.5 inch wide, so we're working on the same cut as before, but now we've got a whole band. If we sew every one of them from top to bottom in the same direction, you can actually push the fabric out and end up with a bent set of strips, which is harder to deal with.
Okay.
So to make this strip set, I do have a nice even edge on one end, but because these aren't one range, I've got all different lengths on this end. I've sewn this pair together from the top down, I've sewn this pair together from the top down, and while it may look like I've actually started at the top for the final seam in the middle, I've actually laid it out together and then come down and started from the uneven edge and pushed back.
Okay.
So it's pretty critical that you do sew in different directions as you sew along.
Right. Now, Anne doesn't cross-cut her strips straight. These ones are actually cross-cut using a template. So that leads us to the next discussion about making templates and template plastic.
Yes. A little bit slower than cross-cutting.
Yep.
But really important.
Okay.
Template plastic can come in 2 ways. It can come plain with no markings at all on it.
Yes.
Or it can come, here's one we cut up earlier, with a grid on it.
Right.
Choice is yours as to which one you use. Either one, though, will actually have a rough side and a smoother side. You draw on the smooth side, but you put the rough side on the fabric, so it's got a bit more grip.
Right.
I find that a nice Sharpie permanent marker won't come off, so that your markings are permanent. The patterns for Anne's quilt are on the pattern sheet in the magazine. So you'll take your template plastic, place it over the pattern. In this case, because they're straight lines, I actually drew the points up and then took a ruler to line it up.
Okay.
Really important to mark on your grain line for your template, so you know where that's going and what template number or letter that is, so that you can put it back to the pattern.
Right. And then it's just a case of cutting them out, and remember, always have a pair of paper or template plastic scissors separate to your fabric scissors.
Absolutely. The kids' scissors, not your good ones.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
All right, now we have our templates all cut up here, so we're going to start by using the main template, which is the diamond shape in the strips on Anne's quilt.
That's the main feature of Anne's quilt.
Right, so how do we do this?
So we have our set of strips that we've already made. They're 8.5 inches. The template actually measures the full width of the strips. This time we'll actually draw with the light pencil along the edge of the template to give us our lines that we're going to cut from.
Now, there are heaps of marking pencils on the market, so it's really just a personal preference, isn't it, what you want to use?
And it will change depending upon the colours that you're working with.
Yep.
I do like a lead pencil if it's just a light fabric, but silver or white chalk are good for dark fabrics.
Okay.
Then we can take our rotary cutter and cut neatly along the drawn lines. Again, I'm cutting away from myself. So I've cut that first side, I'll move the balance of the strip, and then I can come back and cut the second side. And it can be that easy to now create a diamond instead of a square. And you can simply continue down the strip as we did before, only this time you'll be with your template.
Yep.
Again, if it won't line up on the next one because, and again, there's just not even 1/8 of an inch discrepancy. I could have fudged a little bit as I've done my seam allowance, the phone rang and I deviated a bit.
Right.
The template is the given, so I will work to the template. So again, I'll redraw, and I might actually give myself a little bit more room so I've got something to cut off, and redraw both sides and cut down your length of your strip. So you actually have a template project further on, so we'll talk about it again.
Yes. And I have a different method for making templates, so we'll look at a couple of ways of doing them.
There certainly is more than one way to make a template, Claire. Ta-da!
Fantastic.
See, as I said, not a lot in trimming, but it is
Just makes a
important to
difference.
be accurate. Yeah.
Okay. And the final thing I'd just like to walk through is the actual construction of the strips in Anne's quilt, but we're actually going to have to go over and stand in front of it to do that.
We will have to move, Claire, yep.
Well, Michelle, we just want to talk quickly about how the actual rows are being constructed here. So can you tell us what we need to do to make them?
Claire, this quilt has the blocks, in this case they are a diamond, but they're down on point.
Right.
So therefore, when we construct the quilt, we're actually going to sew them together in diagonal rows, which is a little bit trickier than what we've done previously in Katrina's quilt. If we go to Katrina's quilt, they're sewn straight across, so it's nice and easy to see how to line it up. All your edges are going to be even when you sew the rows. When we come back to Anne's quilt, as we look down here, when we put the side triangle on, which is also cut with the template plastic on its strips, this edge will line up beautifully. The fine point of the triangle will actually extend past the edge, and that's correct.
Okay.
You don't want it to line up. If you line up, you won't have your seam allowance at the next stage.
Right.
And also, because Anne has used two different types of strips, you're going to have a different top to either strip.
Okay.
In this case, template B, which we showed earlier, is the top of the strip with a bit of background, but on the next one over, it's the full diamond, and then there's another template again, a smaller template of the background.
Okay.
Everything is still always constructed in the diagonals, and you will end up then at the end with a straight strip this way, and then it's nice easy sewing again.
All right. Well, that's it for strip piecing and templates, so we're moving on to half square triangles now.
And bias edges.
Oh, that's all right. You'll show us how to do them.
Yep, absolutely.
Now we're going to look at Karen Stiles' quilt, which uses a traditional churn dash block. And the technique we're specifically looking at is half square triangles. So Michelle, can you tell us the components of the block and how it's put together?
The block uses two main components, Claire. Strip piece, like we've made previously with Katrina's, only this time it's made into two rectangles to make the square instead of four even squares. The other one in the corners is a half square triangle unit. Well, now we're starting to deal with a bias edge.
Okay.
So to start with, you'll find that Karen's actually given you instructions in the magazine to cut these guys slightly bigger than they need to be. We've got a 4-inch strip, and we're now going to cross cut it into squares, which is the starting point for our half square triangle.
Okay.
So the terminology is starting to make sense.
Yep.
But what I would say is that I've got two different rulers here, and I'm going to teach you about the 45-degree line on your ruler. Depending upon the ruler that you have, it may be in a different position.
All right then.
So it will make no difference at all. I'll demonstrate with the smaller one first, in that when you lay the ruler down, it's just slightly easier. We had our larger ruler before. I've just come down to a smaller one so that it wasn't hanging off the edge of the table and getting in my road.
Yep.
When I place the ruler down, when I line up my 4-inch on my cut edge and the 4-inch on the other cut edge that I have, as I've already previously cut squares from this strip, my 45-degree line goes through both corners. It's quite easy on the smaller ruler, but it's not always in the corner of the ruler. In this case, it's actually part way down the side.
Okay.
So you're actually working slightly backwards. So you line up, again, the line on the base with the 45 in my bottom corner now. I can line it up until it hits my top corner.
Right.
So you're not on the edge of the fabric with this ruler. It doesn't make any difference what ruler, but if you are cutting a square, it's a nice idea to check where your 45-degree line is, because if you even move it by 1/8 of an inch, it looks relatively square to your eye, but you're actually going to end up with a rectangle.
Right.
So that's just a little tip for cutting squares. So a 90-degree cut with my 45 through, I can get a true square.
Okay.
So for Karen's quilt, you take a light square and a dark square, 4 inches in size. We could now take our ruler and simply cut this into 2 half square triangles.
Yep.
What that will do though is actually expose the bias edge, and then it's likely to stretch as we sew it on the machine. So instead, we're going to take the light one of the two, turn it over, and with our ruler line up the 2 corners, although my ruler is not right on the corner. If I put my ruler on the corner, my pencil lead will actually end up past the corner.
Yes. Yep.
So I'm actually slightly off so that then when I do a little test, my pencil is right through the corner. So I'm going to draw the pencil line from corner to corner.
And always on the light fabric?
It's easier to see on the light fabric. In this case, we possibly could have used the other because it hasn't been a dyed base fabric that it's been printed on, but it's the one that you can see your line on easiest. It certainly doesn't need to be on both because we can only see one when we pair it up and put it onto the machine. The beauty of doing it this way is that while we have a guide for our sewing line, we haven't cut that bias edge, so it's less likely to distort.
Yes.
So now we're going to place the 2 squares right sides together. And at this stage I will pin because they will move. But not on my sewing line. I'm actually pinning past the sewing line. So now we're ready to sew.
All right then.
Actually, I won't. I was going to change my stitch length, but we're going to trim this block down.
So you've left it at 2?
I've left it at 2, where we had it for our strips, so that we can have a nice stable stitch on the edge of the block. I'm just running the very edge of the foot on the very line that we've drawn.
Okay.
Now, if you were making this quilt at home, you could work a whole series of these pieces in together, but I've only got one, so I'll take it out, cut it, and pull it round.
And that's actually what we call chain piecing, isn't it?
It is, and it saves a lot of time and a lot of thread. So where possible, chain piecing is a really good thing to do. So that now, the pins we don't need anymore. We've actually got a square with 2 lines of sewing in it and 1 drawn line that will give us our required result.
Okay.
So we can cut up, and it could be with scissors. I just find it's a lot quicker. With a rotary cutter, we can cut that apart. Well, now we've gone from 1 square to 2 squares, which now we've also still got a light and a dark.
Yep.
So again, I'm going to press towards my dark, or you might press towards my dark for me.
All right then.
Before we can trim this back to our correct size.
Okay then. Michelle, I've ironed or pressed your squares and I've pressed towards the dark for you, so they're all ready to trim now.
Thank you very much, Claire.
It's all right.
While you were doing that, I went and grabbed the rotating mat because
Okay.
we're now actually going to trim these down. We made these a little bit bigger, which is a good safety net for beginner quilters when you're dealing with a bias edge. I must say I still use it myself because I like nice points, and if I make it bigger and can trim it down, then I get a better result.
Okay.
So now we're just going to take a little bit off these guys. So again, that 45-degree line that I spoke about earlier needs to go on the seam line this time. And the size that we want to trim this back to is 3.5 inches. So with the beauty of the rotating mat, I can cut 2 sides, but I must keep the 45 on the seam. So I can cut the first side, and because it's shorter, I'll actually cut the second side. Without disturbing the edges, I can turn the mat around, bring my 45-degree line back, place that down with my 3.5 on my neatly cut edges that I've just done, and I can cut the final 2 sides.
Excellent.
It is, and it may seem slow, but you can go back through and cut all of those while you're watching a good movie.
Right.
Before you go on to the next process.
Okay, and that is?
To put this together, it's 3 rows, just like we did for Katrina's in the first section.
Yep.
Except in this case, they're all 3.5 inch raw edge units
Okay.
that we're talking about. So the top row is our 2 half square triangles with a strip section between it. Then we've got a strip, a square, a strip, half square triangles and a strip in the base.
Okay.
Again, pressing for opposing directions means that we're in, out, in, and it will lock into one another when you sew the seams together for the rows.
Wonderful. And finally, the last thing I'd like to talk about is that Karen's quilt is another quilt which is at on point.
It is. So it's the same construction as we had for Anne's, in that the quilt will actually be constructed in full diagonal lines across the quilt.
Right.
So it's still straight, but on the diagonal.
Okay, we've talked now about half square triangles and we're about to move on to quarter square triangles, but you just wanted to show a couple of diagrams before we did that. So can you explain about the grain lines?
When we had a square that was cut earlier, you can't see the grain line, but within any square, when we cut it on grain, when we cut the original strip, any square will have 4 straight of grain edges, so 4 stable edges.
Right.
The first thing that we did for this quilt was to cut it in half to give it a half square triangle. When you do that, you can see immediately that that triangle has 2 straight of grain edges and only 1 bias edge. Right. So that when these 2 triangles are sewn together, the outside of that is still on grain, so no stretch.
Yep.
We're about to move on and do quarter square triangles. So again, I've drawn the same set of arrows onto the block, but now when we cut twice to make 4 triangles from 1 square, these guys only get 1 straight of grain edge and have 2 bias edges inside. So you've got double the stretch to look for, but it's important that you know where that is, because you always want to keep your bias on the inside of the block or a quilt and not on the outside.
Yep.
You will deal with it, but you want it to end up with the straight of grain at the edge when your blocks are finished or your quilts are finished.
Okay then. All right, well let's get on and have a look at Michelle Yeo's quilt, which has got thousands of quarter square triangles.
Many quarter square triangles in different sizes.
All right then. Now it's time for quarter square triangles and we're looking at Michelle Yeo's quilt. So is this a similar technique to half square?
It is the same. Yep.
Okay.
First of all, you need to make the choice, do you cut or do you draw? My choice would be to draw, again, so that we've got the stability for the bias. In this case, though, the unit that we're making actually has 3 fabrics in it, not 2. So we've actually got 2 combinations to make for our first step.
Okay.
So again, we'll draw the line on the back and we'll sew on either side. This time...
So what are the combinations you've got? You've got the brown and the patterned and then the brown and the pink, is that right?
Yes.
Yep.
Because the brown comes into the block twice and the other 2 colours are only once.
Okay.
Michelle's actually chosen quite a busy background as it's a vintage reproduction and often they were busy.
Right.
Now, a couple of pins to hold them together. And this time I can show how we chain piece, because I've got 2 to sew back to back. In this case, we can't make it bigger and trim back, so I can take my stitch length up to normal now. So I've taken it back up to 2.4. Now, as I've gotten to the end of that one, I'm not taking the needle out. I'll just lift the foot so now that I can access the next edge. Okay. Had I picked up the scissors, it might have been a good idea, but that's okay. We'll use a thread cutter on the machine. So now I'm right to do the second side of the line, just like before.
Do you find that you use a knee lift very often with your machine?
I do when I'm appliquing and quilting, not so much when I'm piecing.
Right.
And it can depend upon the situation. If I'm in a class situation, I won't because I tend to knock it more.
Okay.
But for applique, it's fantastic because you can do it hands-free.
Yep.
So we can cut these apart. There's one forgot to pick the scissors up. So we'll cut along that original drawn line. And these will now go off to the ironing fairy.
All right, I will be the ironing fairy for the day.
And there's one consistent in this one in the brown, so I'll press both towards the brown.
All right, I'll press those for you now then.
Thank you.
Right, Michelle, your ironing fairy's back, and here are your pressed pieces.
Thank you. We now have what we started with last time, 4 half square triangle units, but we want to make it into a quarter square.
Okay.
So we need to take one of our dark light and one of our dark medium and turn them around so that they lock into one another. I'm going to draw another diagonal line, but with the magic of patchwork, we now have 4 triangles sewn together.
Okay.
Yeah. So they'll lock in. I haven't locked them in at the moment because I need to draw the line.
So unlike Karen's quilt, these ones don't need trimming at all?
No, you can't actually make them any bigger and trim them back.
Yep.
We need to sew them accurately the first time.
Okay.
It's too hard to try and get all 4 of the seams to line up.
Yep.
So now that seam that we've pressed in the 2 different directions is just going to line up. What I will do, because it's bugging my eye, is just trim the dog ears off.
Okay.
They're not needed for anything. They're the extra seam allowance that you need to get around the point of a triangle, but they worry your eye. I didn't use my ruler because it was such an easy thing to do.
Right.
So now instead of pinning the main body, I'm going to pin the seam allowance, which because we've gone dark and it's in the opposite direction is now opposing.
Okay.
Doesn't really matter because I'm going to sew that seam, but I'm going to pin that seam together. Which seam allowance I'm actually going to do, but I will get the one right in the middle. So now 1/4 inch on either side of my drawn line again.
Right.
Slowly, slowly over the pin. Yes.
Something we actually haven't talked about yet is what size needle do you use in your sewing machine?
I use a universal 80 for the majority of my piecing. When I'm quilting, I use a denim 80 or 70, it depends.
Okay.
Has a sharper point. There are now quilting needles, which weren't available before. But regardless of what type of needle you're using, a new needle, not an old blunt one.
Yes.
No matter what the size.
And I mean, really about 8 hours is recommended.
Absolutely. Less if you're quilting
Yep.
or if you're paper piecing, which we're going to deal with later.
Okay then.
You'll actually hear the sound of the machine. It'll start popping your fabric
the
when your
threads.
needle's
Right.
blunt. So if you can hear pop, 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 good indication you need
Change
a
your
new
needle.
needle. Now, from those 2 squares, I can make one more cut. And it will give us
Magic.
the points on our star. So from the 2 pieces that we started with originally of each of the colours, I've now got, if I was to sew the others together, we would have the 4 points necessary for 1 star unit.
Okay. Now, would you go back and trim these dog ears as well before you start constructing the block?
I would.
Okay.
Yeah, because they go back together with a plain square, it's just easier to line up a straight edge rather than have those dog ears laying out to the edge. We haven't discussed the centre of the block, but it's actually the exact same technique that we've just done here, but it's only 2 colour combinations and it's a much smaller scale. These ones were 5 1/4 cut, these guys are only 3 1/4 cut.
Right. And Michelle's quilt again is simple to put together into rows, it's just
set straight
yep.
with a sashing between.
All right.
Yes,
great.
So nice simple one to put together once you get all your points.
Okay.
Bias is done.
All right, well we've done triangles now, so we're going to move on to another technique which is called partial seams.
Yeah, they're not that hard to do.
Excellent, we'll have a look at those.
Yeah.
Kim Harris has made a really fun owl quilt and it features 2 more techniques we're going to look at now, which are partial seams and fussy cutting. So Michelle, let's start with fussy cutting. What's that?
Fussy cutting means that we're going to cut a particular section of the fabric rather than a strip that we've cross-cut, so that we can place something into the centre of the square in this particular case. Or in Deborah Louie's quilt that we'll deal with later on, she's cut little flowers into the centres of her hexagons. So
okay, then.
Same technique, different shape.
Yep.
The easiest way is to go back to template plastic and to cut the size of the template that you want.
Right.
For your quilt. So for Kim's, it's a 7.5 inch square, so it's quite easy. I haven't marked a grain line on it because it is square. I know where my grain is going to be this time.
Yep.
But it means that I can place it down over our fabric and I can centre our owl easily and see what I'm going to get.
Okay.
I mean, we could get 2 circles if we wanted, but if I slide down, I can't use the owl on the bottom because he's too close. It wouldn't put it into the centre of the block.
Right.
So the fabric will end up looking like Swiss cheese when we're finished.
And I mean, that's an important point as well, is that if you do want to fussy cut your fabric and you're looking at requirements for a quilt, you need to allow for more fabric.
Absolutely. So you need to look at where your print repeat is when you're purchasing and know how many you want.
Yep.
Also, this fabric that we're using is a flannel quilt. So it has a little bit more stretch than normal fabric because it's a little bit looser in its weave. So I've just drawn around our little owl.
Yep.
Kim's used 3 different colours in the quilt. Then we can come back with our rotary cutter. In this case, you really can't, if you try to cut right on the line, I'll guarantee you'll leave a little bit behind. So we just want to go a little bit past the lines. I mean, if we were lucky enough and you had a square the right size, you could just pop the square down, but we can't have every ruler in every size available to us.
Very true.
Now, I have to, I'll turn the whole thing just because I've got such a bulky piece of fabric, because otherwise I would have had to have cut towards myself. And that is just not safe. But now we can take out of our Swiss cheese our cute little owl.
Very nice.
He is beautiful. So now the block itself, if I lay out our pieces for our block, nothing is actually going to line up. So it's like, where do you start?
Start sewing, yep.
Because there is nothing that lines up. We do have a straight edge here, but it doesn't complete across the block. So we're actually going to sew the first seam halfway.
Okay.
Then I can sew the second, the third, the fourth, and then the second half of one.
Okay, right.
So to start with, I can take one, and it really doesn't matter which way you start.
Right.
Something else that we have done with this quilt, Claire, is look at the colours just before I sew it together. The yellow and the pink are the top and the bottom, and the green and the blue are the 2 sides, so that they will, the green and the blue will end up running up and down the quilt.
Yes.
The yellow and pink will run across.
Okay.
And it ends up looking like the whole quilt is woven, and that's the whole idea of this block.
Okay.
Yeah. So it really doesn't matter which one you start with. But if I take the yellow, which is our top, I'm only going to sew about 10 centimetres on there.
All right. Now, do you pin this at all, or?
Flannel's quite grippy, so no, I'm not going to pin it. And the other thing too is that I'm back to my normal stitch length.
All right.
I find that if I sew with a small stitch length on flannel, it really does stretch it out.
Okay.
So I'm only about halfway down. I found my scissors in the break.
Good.
I'll trim my threads off.
That's another good tip with patchwork, isn't it? To keep your threads trimmed as you're working, because otherwise at the end you can end up with quite a mess.
They migrate to the front of the quilt, and then you can end up with, you trim the fabric when you trim the thread. I don't actually, when I'm doing this technique, I don't necessarily iron.
Okay.
Because I don't want to get up and down all the time. So I might just finger press that seam, and the flannel itself holds fairly well. But you can now see
it lines up.
That fits beautifully now.
Yep.
So now I can complete the entire seam 2. If at this stage you felt that it might move, you might pin that final bit of the block.
Okay.
But on short seams with flannel I tend not to. Long ones, absolutely. So for the girls working at home, you would have each one of the blocks in the quilt made to the same stage. So you could chain all of the blue to the centre block.
Okay.
So seam 2 now fitted beautifully. 3 will go along the base. I find flannel quilts can be really lovable because they're just so cuddly.
Yes. I have 2 on the couch at home and they're delicious in winter.
Absolutely. Everybody fights over them.
Well, that's why I made 2, so one for myself and one for my husband.
We only have 1. So piece 3, piece 4 on the other side. So we're almost back to where we started. You wouldn't want to do a partial seam on something too small where you couldn't really easily access the seam to fold it back.
Right.
So it would need to be a reasonable size. So finger press there, and then the first seam is now our last seam. And this is why when you're doing something smaller, you can't get in, you actually end up...
Yeah.
So you want to do a partial seam on something that you've got a little bit of space on. Now what I did do, and I didn't say earlier, it was just something I did by default, I sewed with the seam allowance visible to me so that I could watch what way it was flicking to. It's something I like to do, whether it's borders or a block. If something's going to change direction, I want to know about it before it gets there so that I'm not unpicking it and changing it later on.
It can be very frustrating.
Well, particularly when you come to quilting. So get rid of that thread in the middle. In this quilt, you might have seen a shadow behind it when you layered it up. So it really is quite important to keep it neat. But that little block, really easy with a partial seam in it.
I mean, when you laid it out, it looks quite daunting.
Because there's no obvious start.
Yes.
Yeah.
But no, it looks fantastic.
Yeah. Your first is your last as well. With that quilt, Kim actually did the borders in the same manner. Because the border is a checked fabric, the rails around the owl, for want of a better term, is continued out into the border, and they're also put on as a partial seam. So there was no joining of the checked border.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're moving on now to Y seams.
Oh, why do we have to go there?
Michelle, we've come to looking at your lovely quilt now, and it is, again, using strip piecing, but we're looking at another technique again here, which is Y seams. So can you walk us through the processes to make your quilt?
Yep, not a problem, Claire.
Okay.
We've already gone through strip piecing earlier on.
Yep.
Both Katrina's and Anne's used sets of strips sewn together. I have too, but in this case, I've actually made a tube that we're going to cut our pieces from. So there's 8 different fabrics that go to make up the diamond. So strip set 1, strip set 2. So none of the fabrics are repeated, and when we cut it, we'll actually get 2 different colourways out.
Right.
So we just need to make sure that we're consistent in that if we look at the lovely umbrella fabric, it sits back with the floral. So those 2 fabrics need to go together every time when you make your strip sets. So again, I've sewn 2 outsides down and the centre one back up the other way on a shorter stitch length.
Right.
So once the strip sets are sewn together into the tube, we're going to use a template as well. But in this case, it's an acrylic template. It's a 45-degree kaleidoscope ruler.
Okay.
So we've recently done a DVD on a huge Lone Star where we cut diamonds from strip sets. I got thinking about it and I thought, well, if this is a 45-degree half diamond, why can't I cut them out of strip sets and make it easier to cut?
Yep. So
instead, we're going to line the ruler up on our strip sets at the 7 3/4 mark. So with the tip on one edge, we can line up with our base, and then we can cut one side. So we've cut one side.
Right.
I'll come back and trim that one in a moment because I still want to cut away from myself. But then I can flip it over and cut the second side. In this case, I'm lucky it's lining up.
So the measurement of your ruler you're getting from this length?
Yes.
So it's got nothing to do with where you're lining up the point or...
Well, realistically, it really should come right to the edge, but I can afford to be a little bit off because this is just my seam allowance at the top.
Right.
Yep. Sorry, Claire, I'm just
that's
going to have
okay.
to, so that I can cut away. Once these guys are cut, that little bit of stitching that was at the top actually pulls apart really easily.
Oh, that's very tricky.
So there's a diamond.
That's what I love about patchwork and quilting, is that there's all these little tricks to things.
And then when I cut this guy, because it's been cut from the top and the bottom, we're actually going to get 2 different diamonds out of one set of strips.
Okay.
When I ironed it, I've given the pressing directions in the notes, and all of the seams are pressed in a particular manner, so they're actually rolling right around, so that when I turn this guy around, they're going to lock in.
Oh, the seams will lock in, right.
So the majority of the fabrics in this are actually K-facet, with a few fun spots to break it up. If you look at where the brown spots and the orange spots are, that'll tell you where to put it in the block.
Yep. Okay.
There's 2 different blocks in the quilt. One have the brown and the green spots in the centre. The others have the orange and brown.
Okay.
So you just need to decide which colourway of the star that you're making.
Yes.
And pick up 2 diamonds.
Okay.
In this case, I've already started to prepare one to the side here with the green in the centre. So I'll turn this guy back around. And the seam, I won't iron it, I can just finger press it, and they're all going one way. But this one, because it's cut from the other side of the strip, it's actually coming down. So that, again, when I lay these together, they're actually going to lock in.
Right.
And normally Y seams can be a little bit funny if you don't know where to stop, but because we have the seam, we're actually going to sew down to the seam line and no further.
Right.
Not going to continue right off the edge like we have with everything else or even our strips.
Okay then.
So we're only sewing to the seam, so it's going to stop 1/4 of an inch short.
Mm-hmm.
On the outside edge, which is where we need to insert our triangles.
All right then.
I've pinned my seams along. The tip goes straight through, there's no offset, it all lines up, and we can sew from the centre, but I'm now going to stop at that point where the seam is, so 1/4 inch short of the edge.
And you're using the normal stitch length for this piece of sewing?
I am, because we've already cross-cut it, it's not going to go anywhere.
Right.
Now, if you go too far, it's not really a concern because we can just come back and unpull a stitch.
Okay.
I do like to leave a tail though, so that I can come back and tie that off if it becomes loose.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives us the 2 diamonds sewn together, which is starting to form the centre.
Yes.
And the Y seam that you talked about is what we now need to sew in order to put the background in. Whether it's the square or the triangle, it's the same technique.
Okay.
On this one, we had a point where we could sew to, and we knew where to stop. Now we don't have anything to line up here, so I would suggest for the girls to actually put in just the crossover point, not a whole seam, just so that we know what to line up. Because all I need is where those 2 lines cross over.
Yep.
So you're still going to place it down right sides together, but you're going to match from, I'll take the thread out of the way. So where that seam finishes, we need to take the pin through at that point and match that up to where our crossover point was on our background.
Right.
Because we're not sewing right through to the edge, so we need to know where that is. And I'm actually going to sew the other side. No, I will do that side. Well, there is no right or wrong.
Yeah.
That seam just needs to line up.
Okay.
So I'll take that out and pin, and I know that I'm going to start from that point again. And I'll just put one down. With the triangles, it actually meets up with the diamond.
Mm-hmm.
I could pin these because they're likely to flip, but I think I'll be okay because I can see what's going to happen. So I'm going to sew from my pin, from my seam. And because of the bulk, the foot won't want to go over that. Well, it holds the foot too far off the fabric, so it won't allow it to feed evenly. And I'm being very gentle because I have got 2 bias edges exposed. So that we haven't, I've missed a little bit, it's come in a little bit, it's moved, but that's not going to be critical to it.
All right then.
It is, however, matching on this side. Okay, so we've finished this seam, and I'm now going to go back and flip that over, take all our threads out of the way, and I've pushed all the bulk of that seam away as well. lined up this end of the triangle with the diamond. And pin through to find that point again. But that goes out of the way. Now I can sew the other side of the Y.
Right.
So this is not a technique that you can chain piece. You have to do each step
one individually.
Yep. I'll pull that out because it was stopping me from getting right up to the stitch. So that, when we turn through, the pressing, again, it doesn't really matter, but I've pressed the other two to the left so that when the quilt goes together, we can actually get it to a pose, as we've been talking about. So I want that one to go to the left and I want to come away from the bulk. It's untidy, but I will come back and tie these threads off.
Yep.
But that actually sits beautifully and flat in there now, and it gives me a lovely point on the right side when it's flat. So I have pressed away from the bulk of the strip piece diamonds into the background, and that will give you a nice flat finish.
Fantastic. And so the squares are inset in exactly the same way?
They are.
Right.
The only difference with the square is that it will actually line up on the outside edge.
Okay, yep.
But still, you'll need to draw that point in, the 1/4 inch crossover on your inside edge.
Okay, terrific.
When they go in.
Oh, well, the Y seams aren't quite as daunting as you made out, Michelle?
No, but they are bias to bias.
Yeah, so you just need to take a bit of care.
Take it easy, take it slow and pin it and you'll be right.
And the blocks in your quilt, once again, are set straight, so no need to worry about diagonal piecing or anything else?
No, set straight, but I did do something a little bit quirky. I put a border on 2 sides of the block so it offsets them. So it's not really sash, but the blocks don't line up.
Okay, wonderful. Well, next up we're going to look at curved piecing, so I better get out my bits and pieces to demonstrate that.
I get to ask you a few questions for a change.